Because of the release of Watch Dogs Legion, I decided this year to first do playthroughs of Watch Dogs 1 and 2. I had played both these titles in the past, way before I made videos like this. Watch Dogs 1 I 100%ed, but Watch Dogs 2 I just couldn't find myself getting as into. I found its story hard to follow, and never knew for certain what my end goal was. But after the past few years of studying video games and game design through university, and then earlier this year playing Watch Dogs 2 with this fresh perspective on games these classes had given me, Smitty Weberman Jagerman Jensen, I couldn't help but feel a deep respect for what this game attempted to do. In today's video essay, we'll be discussing what I believe it is Ubisoft aimed for with Watch Dogs 2, and why I believe they handled it expertly. Watch Dogs 2 was the sequel to the first game of the same name, which originally released in 2014. The game took a serious tone, with your edgy vigilante protagonist Aiden Pierce on a mission to find those responsible for killing his niece after he hacked into something he wasn't supposed to see. This was a story of unraveling these mysteries and uncovering the dark criminal underworld running in Chicago. While this could turn out to be an interesting tone for the series to take if this is how it would be continued, the sequel instead decided to do something completely different. Rather than having a serious tone as an edgy vigilante out for revenge, Watch Dogs 2 became way more lighthearted, vibrant, charming, and even goofy at times. It did a complete 180 from Watch Dogs 1 in terms of how its story is told, featuring a cast of characters not only out to expose the truth of large corporations to the world, but unlike Aiden Pierce, to also have fun doing it. Fun isn't something one considers when hacking the world. Watch Dogs 2 is an open world game, and while some story missions only become available as certain events take place, many can be done in pretty much any order. Watch Dogs 1 told one big story, but Watch Dogs 2 instead tells many little stories that largely exist on their own. It's like Watch Dogs 1 is a movie, and Watch Dogs 2 is a TV show, where every episode is something different, and if you miss one episode, then you haven't missed a ton from the overall story, because each of these little stories is relatively disconnected. One mission could be you sneaking in to save a movie actor from a corrupt church. Another mission you could have a more serious tone of helping to save one of your allies, including helping them emotionally as well. And then in another one, you could be jumping in to drive a bus on a fun road trip to the equivalent of Google in this world to hack them. Each of these stories exists largely as their own entities with their own tone and plot. As such, in the past, I found the story of this game somewhat hard to follow, and would be confused as to what the end goal here even was. But nowadays, I realize that Watch Dogs 2 isn't about telling some big story, it's about telling several different stories that each make their own arguments. One of the most interesting game design classes I've taken thus far in university has been on the use of history in video games. The main focus of the course was on historical video games for the way they portray the past, but it also dabbled on how games will make arguments, historical or not. It taught many lessons about how games will portray their worlds, characters, and plots, and the significance behind it, many lessons of which I've applied into my other video essays. When judging realism in media, people will target the social and cultural aspects of it, whether it be a woman fighting in Battlefield 5, same-sex relationships in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or Zelda's inflatable pool floaty looking ass in Breath of the Wild, while other aspects such as the physical laws of the world or the media are typically just accepted instead of contested. In historical games such as Battlefield 5 or Assassin's Creed Odyssey, these kinds of criticisms stem from the perspective of historical accuracy, arguing that such a thing did not happen during those times, even though they actually did in both of those examples. But for a game set outside the history of our own world, why should that game follow what people expect to be cultural norms anyway? The world becomes a reflection of the art style and choices on the part of the developers for how they want their world to be shaped. Who are we to say they're not allowed to do it a certain way? One of the most important takeaways from the class was about how video games, and media in general, will make arguments. An excellent example of this is the game Kaboul Kaboom, a flash game from 2002 where the player had to collect falling hamburgers while avoiding bombs. There's no way to truly win this game, just avoid the bombs while collecting hamburgers for as long as you can. This game was created during a time where the US Army would airdrop food supplies out of the same planes they would drop bombs out of during the Afghan War, which should give you a rough idea of the arguments that Kaboul Kaboom was making. Kaboom Kaboom is an example of a game that exists with the purpose of making arguments, but most games aren't like this. In most games, you need to read between the lines a bit and infer what arguments a piece of media may be making. Games don't even need to be based on history or our own world to make arguments, because all games are capable of drawing parallels to our world. Take Fire Emblem Three Houses for example, the game equivalent of how many political issues and ideas can we cram into one fictional game world? That game's arguments may be worthy of a video on its own, but for now we'll just be using one example, being the people of Duscur. In the Kingdom of Fargus, the king winds up being assassinated, with the popular belief that it was someone from the land of Duscur who was responsible, when in reality this was not the case, and the people of Duscur didn't even generally have any ill will towards the king. Despite this, the people of Duscur were blamed for the king's death, and began to be treated as the lesser kind of human being. Fire Emblem Three Houses is a fictional world, but that doesn't keep it from making arguments about our world. In this example, it portrays how people can become deluded into attributing a negative connotation of one or a few individuals to their entire people. They heard that one person from Duscur was to blame for their king's death, and therefore treat everyone from Duscur as these savages who are less than human. It's a fictional world, but it draws parallels to our real world on one of the major ways for racism to begin. It's an incorrect way of thinking, attributing the behaviors or actions of a few individuals to their entire people, and is responsible for some of the largest tragedies and greatest violence in history. Even fictional worlds can draw parallels to and make arguments about our world, and Fire Emblem Three Houses is an excellent example of this. Games can also make arguments about what they choose to include and what they exclude. In a historical game, what parts of the time period are worth telling, and what can be left out? Take Assassin's Creed Unity for example, a game set in the French Revolution where you play as the assassin Arnaud Dorian. Well, there was actually one famous assassin of the French Revolution, and she was a woman, Charlotte Corday. So, in a game about assassins during the French Revolution, a time where there was one famous assassin and woman, you play as a dude. What our professor didn't tell us is Assassin's Creed Unity actually does have a mission to solve the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, which leads you to Charlotte Corday. I believe this is an example where the game isn't exactly trying to go out of its way to make arguments, but it can be interpreted as arguments. How you personally interpret a game about assassins in the French Revolution, where you play as a man during a time where the only real famous assassin was a woman, is up to you. Games will make arguments in countless ways, through their lore and their world, through what they decide is important enough to include, or exclude, through the ways they portray the characters, through the events of their plot, through the gameplay, even through the music. One day I may make a dedicated video on how video games make arguments. Consider the past section of arguments a mini version of that. So why is it important to establish that games make arguments? Because after 4 years, I feel like I finally understand the purpose of Watch Dogs 2. While Watch Dogs 1 was focused on telling a story, Watch Dogs 2 had its focus on making arguments. Rather than telling one large story, it tells several short individual stories that each make their own arguments to educate players on just how technology and systems can and are misused. For example, take the main mission, Power to the Sheeple, where our main characters learn about how the corporation Invite is gathering information on its users, building a profile on them, and using it to choose what information to display to its users to help influence them towards voting for Invite's puppet to be elected. Well, this is ridiculous, right? It's crazy to think about, but there's no way that stuff like this actually happens in our world, right? Well, unfortunately, this is possible, and it's probably been happening in our world for quite some time now. Companies such as Google and Facebook, the latter of which I'd say Invite and Watch Dogs 2 is clearly meant to represent, sites like these that don't charge you anything, how do they become the insane business giants that they are? Well, if a site or platform isn't selling you a product, then chances are you are the product, having your usage information stored and sold off to those who would use your profile to help influence you and gain greater odds of you acting the way that they want you to. Anybody interested in this topic, I would highly recommend watching the documentary The Social Dilemma, which you can find on Netflix. To quote the documentary, If you can go to someone and you say, give me 10 million and I will change the world 1% in the direction you want it to change, it's the world. That could be incredible, and that's worth a lot of money. Well, this is very possible with the way these platforms are set up and the information that's chosen to convey, whether it be targeted ads or maybe even showing one side of the arguments for a political campaign. The ability to, in essence, program the masses can go to the highest bidder. This is a problem brought directly to the surface in Watch Dogs 2, and even though it may only be a game, arguments like this seem to cross the line directly into our reality. Watch Dogs 2 makes arguments and portrays problems that much of the time are directly from our world, only with made-up names. Let's have a look at a handful of other main missions, shall we? Home Sweet Home features a company of various home services that monitor and sell user information to other companies, such as selling the information that somebody is ordering pizza very often, and then maybe their health insurance could wind up increasing after that information is sold to them. Robot Wars features the characters exposing a tech facility working with the government to create new machines to help keep people in order, which in this case is giant spider bots. False Prophets features a corrupt church called New Dawn that lies to its followers and rewards and treats them based on how much money they've given to the church, and puts them back in line if they begin to have doubts about the church. I won't bother explaining all the arguments I can infer from the game and how they relate to our world, but even with those descriptions alone, you can probably roughly gather what each of those missions are trying to say. Watch Dogs 1 was about telling one overall story, but after 2 dropped that format and created an open world filled with these various incredibly different story missions, I found the overall plot hard to follow, and initially wasn't the biggest fan of the plot that Watch Dogs 2 told. But I realize now that it's not necessarily that Watch Dogs 2 tried to tell a full story and failed, it's that it instead tried to make an experience and world of arguments, and succeeded. It's not about telling one story. It's about dropping the player into all these different individual stories, or episodes of sorts, that each typically help to give arguments about the state of our world, or to give insight into what could be in the works. It presents just how much of the world can be driven by money and corporate greed, and just how much influence and power it can give to people with these systems that we use and rely on daily. I would highly recommend to anybody who goes on to play Watch Dogs 2 to consider with each story mission not exactly what the details of the plot are as I used to, but rather to consider what arguments it might be trying to make and what lessons it may teach. Watch Dogs 1 was about telling a story. Watch Dogs 2 is about making arguments. I used to think the storytelling of this game was mediocre at best, but 4 years and many game design classes later, I can't help but have this newfound respect for this title. I used to expect it to fill a role it had no intention of filling, and was blinded to the role it did achieve of making arguments about our world. In this way, Watch Dogs 2 is an absolutely incredible game through the ways that it portrays and makes arguments about our world in its own unique way. You've been hacked. You've been hacked.
ATMs are here.
Excuse me. Please excuse me.
Ow!
Scooch!
Die!
Falcon kick!
Oh, jeez. I thought you'd just do a single punch, not that. Let me through here.
Die!
Let me through here, please.
Die!
That is the wrong target. Please take down the one who's shooting me.
Falcon punch!
Why are you doing this, Marcus?